I never thought I'd say this in my lifetime, or at least I hoped I'd never say it, but this past week has made movies about nuclear holocaust somewhat relevant. Not that we're on the verge of that occurrence, but nuclear rhetoric is being thrown around, so it's a good time to revisit the greatest movie to ever take on this subject, and that is, of course, Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Dr. Strangelove was released just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so the fear of nuclear destruction was at its peak, and the fear was very justified. Luck was the primary factor in the United States and the Soviet Union averting an all out nuclear war. So leave it to Stanley Kubrick, the man who had 2 years earlier released an adaptation of Lolita, to take on extremely polarizing subject matter and turn it into something accessible for every political point of view. Initially, the film was supposed to be a serious political thriller based on the novel Red Alert, but a couple weeks into the screenwriting process, Kubrick started to believe that a black comedy was the best way to approach the quote, absurd and paradoxical elements of nuclear deterrent. In rewatching the film, thank God he made the decision he did, because I don't think a drama constrained by a bleak and hyper serious tone could have communicated Kubrick's thoughts on the Cold War in a universal and effective way. So that begs the question, what message is being delivered through cowboys riding nuclear weapons and paranoid generals convinced that the communists are destroying the essence of Americans through water fluoridation? If we went through every angle, we would be here for a long time because Kubrick's movies are some of the densest ever put to screen. But after rewatching the movie, there is one idea in particular that resonated with me given the time we're in, and it's an idea that will resonate as long as human beings are around. Before it's presented explicitly through dialogue, the scenery sets it up in typical Kubrickian fashion. The film begins with the bomber being refueled, which was meant to be a sexual innuendo, and as the film goes on, there are a few scenes that don't have some sexual element. The entire crisis begins because General Ripper blames the Soviets for his decreasing sex drive. Many of Kubrick's movies contain the theme of humans battling their primordial desires. In Lolita, the main character is driven into madness by his lust over a teenage girl. In Full Metal Jacket, we get a mix of the urge to violence and sex. The lead squadron is actually called the Lust Hogs. And Eyes Wide Shut is all about the conflict between marriage and the sexual drive. The general message in all of these movies is human beings have limited control over their behavior. Even the most rational people living in the strictest social conditions are not able to tame the animal inside of them. It's kind of like what Paul says in the book of Romans, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. So after the president and the generals realize what Ripper has set into motion, and the audience gets to hear his rationale through one of the best shots in film history, by the way, but after the war room finds out, General Turgidson is questioned about how a base general could possibly launch nuclear weapons that risk the end of the world. The president gets frustrated with his explanation, and then Turgidson retorts with one of my favorite lines of the film.
Retaliatory safeguard.
A safeguard.
I admit the human element seems to have failed us here, but the idea was to discourage the Ruskies from any hope that they could knock out Washington and yourself, sir.
The human element seems to have failed us here. In Lolita, Eyes Wide Shut, and Full Metal Jacket, human error has some horrific consequences, but the stakes don't get anywhere near nuclear annihilation. So to present Kubrick's Cold War concern plainly, how long can error-prone humans be in control of weapons that leave no room for error? There's an amazing line in Dostoevsky's The Brother Karamazov, which is, as a general rule, people, even the wicked, are much more naive and simple-hearted than we supposed, and we ourselves are too. The comedic tone of Dr. Strangelove really fleshes out that quote. General Turgidson is fine with 20 million people dying, he calls it mild casualties, but he's not an evil man. He's just a bumbling fool. Most of the characters are bumbling fools in one way or another. Even the Russian ambassador sets up his leader's drunkenness by saying, he's a man of the people, but he's also a man. The end of the story also strongly pushes this point. When the death of the world appears to be imminent, what are all the men thinking about? A way to set up an underground Playboy mansion. So just minutes before the flashes are about to begin, nobody's calling their family, it's just, how do we best satisfy our desires in this new post-apocalyptic world? I also love how at the end, Dr. Strangelove tells the president that selecting who gets to survive and who dies could be done by a computer algorithm that favors certain factors like youth and health, but government officials and military leaders, well, they must survive to, quote, instill the principles of leadership and tradition. You just know our modern politicians would declare something similar, if put in a doomsday scenario. It's also important to note that many of the characters in the war room only think in terms of political identity groups. There aren't any individual Americans, it's just the American people. And same goes for the Russians. Every Russian falls under the single commie umbrella. That's why men like Turgidson can shrug off death tolls in the millions. It's just a small slice of a single pie, rather than the entirety of millions of pies. The only people that they treat like individuals are themselves. That self important collectivist mindset is one of the key human errors in Dr. Strangelove that leads to problems, and it still plagues our political class today. And even if you go all the way back to antiquity, the greatest kings and political leaders all made major mistakes and had strange insecurities. Alexander decided to cross the Gadrosian desert to one up the heroes of earlier times, and he ended up killing a third of his men. Julius Caesar received more glory than any Roman before him, and he was still self conscious about his bald spot. Up until 1945, those wielding the most power could do terrible things as a result of their personal flaws, but life on Earth would go on. But in 1964 and in 2022, that's not the case. Certain men do possess the power to reset the human species. And if one of those men is not playing with a full deck and is pushed into a corner, well, who knows? We've lived under such conditions for so long, it's easy to forget how absolutely mad that is. And Kubrick captures that madness perfectly. So, how pessimistic should we be? In Doctor Strangelove, there is no last second escape. Kong rides a nuke into Russian soil, the doomsday machine is activated, and it's game over. In regards to the current conflict in Europe, as I said before, we're not at threat level midnight quite yet, but how long is it before the quote human element sets our species back a couple thousand years? I'm not sure about all of you, but it kind of feels like Chekhov's gun on the mantle. It's in the picture, it can never be removed. Maybe it is more a question of when rather than if, but I would love to see a more optimistic perspective in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, I have a few more videos on other Kubrick films. He was an incredible artist with many themes worth discussing. And if you're interested in more videos of this nature, make sure to subscribe on your way out. Thank you so much for stopping by. Have a fantastic rest of your week. I will talk to you soon.